Hello. I heard a wonderful story, and I really thought this could be a very good example of a story which has very big meaning to it and something we can all learn from. A grandmother was turning 90, and as you can imagine, on this big birthday, a grandmother who was still well and able, the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren were all invited to a big birthday party in a big ulam, in a big hall, and everybody came together on this very, very special day. And as the party moved on and as things moved in the direction that they did, the children went off to play, sitting around in circles, and as they were sitting in this circle, one of the ladies, let's call her Chani, the granddaughter of this birthday girl, told a story of what happened to her that day. She told how that lunchtime, that midday meal, after they were finished eating, she asked her 10, 11-year-old daughter to clear the table and take everything off the table. And as our precious little children sometimes do, they lift off too many things for their age, they do things in a hurry, don't do it with much thought. And as this girl cleared the table, her darling little daughter, she dropped a very expensive crystal plate. And of course the first reaction of a mother will be to, why did you do that? I've told you before to be more careful. That was She stopped, she didn't say anything, and she said to her little daughter, next time, maybe be a little more careful, be a little more responsible, very gently, very calmly. She said, when that happened, in that 1 second, as it crashed to the floor, she had a memory. She remembered how, when she was a girl of similar age, it was a Thursday evening, and they were busy preparing for a Sheva Brachos that Shabbos. It was a week of some bride and groom who'd gotten married, and they were making their, for a whole week, there's a week of partying, and they were making the Friday night meal, and had invited lots of guests and lots of people, and her mother was very busy for this, making this, what was going to be a party for this bride and groom who had just gotten married, be a real success. The mother prepared a huge pot of fish, and she said to her daughter, which was this Chani, and she'd said to her, Chani, I have to go out. Please remember, in 2 hours from now, turn off the fish, okay? As special little Chanis are at age 10, 11, 2 hours passed, 3 hours passed, 4 hours passed, and the mother returned to the house smelling of burnt fish. She opened the pot, saw what was inside, was totally silent, took the fish, and she had to throw it out. There was nothing that could be saved from that fish. And she said to Chani, Chani, next time be more responsible. Expensive fish, a lot of hard work, a very hard thing to do to throw all that fish out. When the mother heard that story, which Chani had just said, the mother said, I have to tell you a story. She's the daughter of the birthday girl of that day, and she says, Chani, I remember that story well, when I took all that fish and I had to throw it out. It was expensive, it had been a lot of hard work, and it was hard. But she said, I remember the story from when I was a girl. This grandmother, who's sitting here today, asked me, a young girl, to clear up the kitchen. And I did. Wiped the table, swept the floor, cleared the counters, and in the process of doing that, there was a large pot of cooked soup already, huge pot of soup. Not realizing what it was, this big vegetable soup, I poured it out and washed up the pot. When my mother came, the birthday girl, going back probably something like 60 years previous, she took one look and she said, Hashgacha pratis. It looks like this was not meant to be our vegetable soup. It looks like Hashem didn't want us to have this soup. A shame. And she gave me a lesson on how everything is from Hashem above, that we have exactly what we're meant to have. The work that we've done is sometimes brings out much more fruit and more than we expected, and sometimes work that we do just goes to the garbage. This time my soup and all my hard work, and in those times going back 60 years ago, not all the vegetables were so easily accessible. It was definitely very expensive. It was hard work. No deliveries like they are today in the fruit and vegetables. Things were very different, and it had been a big job for her to get this big pot of soup. She accepted it, and she told me that when she was finished telling that story, the grandmother, the birthday girl of that day, said, you know, I remember that story, and I want to tell you a story now. And she told how when she was 10 years old, that's going back 80 years, seemingly things haven't changed as much as we imagine they have. They were living in a Hungarian village, and it came to Friday night, shortly after lighting, her mother had lit the candles, and as girls do today, and seemingly they did it then, she went out to meet with her friends in some corner of the village where they always met. And her mother said to her, can you take your little sister with you? And no problem, fine. She takes her little sister's hand and off she goes to meet her friends, skipping along. And I don't need to describe to you preteens and young teens. At some point she forgot her younger sister, and suddenly she looked around and her younger sister was nowhere to be seen. Now the dangers of those days were different than the dangers of today, but the dangers were great. It was dark, streets weren't lit up well. They were on the edge of some forest, woods, and a search party. After a while they realized they've really lost her, and they searched for many, many hours. The whole village together were out looking for this girl, frightened, very nervous, very scary hours for her mother, that her little daughter is nowhere to be found with all the dangers that are around. Fortunately, they found her after a few hours, and they were very grateful. And she said, I remember that all my mother said to me was, you must be a little more responsible. She didn't shout, she didn't scream, she didn't get really upset with me, she didn't, you know, give me some major punishment. She just quietly and calmly explained to me that whatever's going on, I must always be responsible. So when I saw that soup being poured out, I remembered this story of my youth. We have here how one small self-control of 80 years previous had an effect on what we know 3 generations ahead. We don't know what this great-grandmother would have said when she heard her daughter of 90 telling this story. Maybe she had a story too, which at the time when her daughter was lost, she remembered how her parents had behaved. Maybe, we don't know. We also haven't got any knowledge of knowing what Chani's daughter, her little 10-year-old of that day who'd broken her fine crystal bowl, will do in 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years' time. But one thing we do know, that small action from 80 years ago of where a mother had total self-control, which is extremely difficult in a time of stress, which is extremely difficult in a time of worry, but she closed her mouth, total self-control, and spoke to her daughter and just said to her, please be more responsible. 80 years later, that action of self-control was still taking shape, increasing, growing, and still alive 80 years later. We don't know. Maybe it'll last for longer. We only know this grandmother and her branch of children, but maybe this great-grandmother had several children and was in control more than once, and maybe this has spread through generations and generations. This was a positive move 80 years earlier, and it brought out positivity for many years to come. Let's look what could have happened. This great-grandmother, and correctly so, could really have been upset with her 10-year-old daughter, screamed at her and shouted at her. This grandmother of 90, who was then a 10-year-old girl, might have thought to herself, you know what, it's not worth my while to go out anymore with my friends on Friday night. It's not worth my while to take my sister with me wherever I go. It's too difficult, I'm not going to do it. It could have changed her social life, it could have changed her life with dealing with her sister, it could have changed her life with dealing with her mother, it could have changed so many things if it had been negative. And then she might have married and passed over those negative vibes to her daughter, and her daughter to her daughter, and 80 years later the situation might have been very, very different. So we see how far one action can go. This is a story of self-control, but it could be a story of chesed, it could be a story of tzedakah, of some great kindness that somebody did and somebody remembered it later on and passed on a different kindness. It could be for some charity where somebody realized how much she benefited from charity and therefore gave charity, and then it could be a story of emes, of truth, where one person spoke emes even in time of difficulty and it passed on, and in later years it paid back as many as 80 years, maybe many, many more. We don't know. I remember when I was a girl, I was also young, maybe 11, 12. I was from a big family, a very large family, and we had many guests for Shabbos. I remember on that Thursday morning, my mother leaving me in the kitchen, and she asked me to roast a huge piece of meat. Now, my father should be gesund, should be well. He always bought meat, ready, kosher meat obviously, but it wasn't yet salted and prepared. You know, in order to eat meat, we know that we have to put it into water, soak it, salt it, wash it off, and only then can it be called kosher, and all the blood which is in it has been drawn out. Only then is it kosher enough to be eaten. Well, my father used to kosher all his own meat, and meat in those times was very expensive, and he was this big chunk which my mother had rolled and sorted it out herself and got it ready for cooking. And she explained to me that she would like it roasted in deep fat oil and leave it there for however long, and after that to cook it in water. She explicitly said to me to pour the fat off before and then put it into boiling water and to cook it. She also left me 1 or 2 other jobs in the kitchen, and somehow I must have forgotten that she told me to take out the fat which was in the pan, and I put the water on top of the fat and cooked the meat in this water, fat, whatever you want to call it. When my mother came home, she went out, and there was no time for telephones to ask any questions, and I remember thinking, do I have to pour the oil off or do I not? Well, I didn't. My mother came home and she saw what I'd done. She lifted off the pot and she said, "Ooh, I'll have to see how to work this one out." I remember that story clearly, and I try to use it in my chinuch. Maybe when I visit my mother next, as Hashem, living in Bnei Brak, maybe I'll ask if she remembers this story. But one thing I do know, I hope my children have gained. In fact, I can say they definitely have. I have a son who, 11-year-old, who wanted to bake a cake, and I gave him I gave him the recipe and he got on with it. For some reason, instead of putting in vanilla sugar, he put in some salt. Now, if you put in 3 spoons of salt instead of your vanilla sugar, the cake is not exactly edible. When it came out of the oven and everyone tasted it, it was like, oh dear. I remembered this story of when my mother had, I don't even know today what happened to that roasted piece of meat, whether she did save it and we ate it, or whether she threw it out and we couldn't eat it. I don't remember. I remember being too scared to ask her. I felt so bad. But I remembered that story when my son did the baking, and there was nothing I could do to save that cake. I said to him, "You know what, leave that cake on the side and I'll see what I can do with it." Late at night, when he'd gone to bed, 11, 12-year-olds going to bed, you know, it wasn't early, and I work on Friday morning, and Shabbos has to be ready. I took that cake, I threw it out, and I made another cake identical. When he woke up in the morning, he said to me, "Mummy, what's with that cake?" I said, "Taste it, see." He tasted it, he said, "Yeah, I can taste a little bit of it. It seems to me that it's okay to eat." I said, "Yes, I also think so. Wow, wonderful, amazing." I know if he's going to really benefit from that story, he doesn't know that I rebaked that cake. But one thing I do know is that I've benefited. And I do know that my mother benefited from not getting upset with me over that roasted piece of meat. Because I continued cooking in the kitchen. I continued in a big way. I enjoyed helping in the kitchen. I enjoyed being in the kitchen alone. I made many big meals for my mother, for all our guests. I loved the kitchen. I still do. But maybe if my mother had been really upset with me, if she'd shouted at me, if she'd have told me that I was really irresponsible and I don't listen to instructions, and give you the list of all the things that mothers could say to girls, I might have never cooked again. She'd have lost out, I'd have lost out, my family would have lost out. Today my children are in the kitchen, they bake, they cook. I love baking, I love cooking, and we have a wonderful time together, and we can invite lots of people. And who knows what that one small action, if it had been negative rather than positive, what could have come out with it. And I think that that's very, very important to remember in a very big way. We have to remember to be in a controlled atmosphere. We have to remember that our actions live on, maybe much longer than we do. We have to remember that what goes on in our youth is very marked on our being, on our personality, and therefore when our children do make mistakes, and children do, we also do, take one second and think, what's worth more? 100 pieces of fish I have to throw out? A crystal bowl? A big pot of soup? Or my child's soul? My child? what's worth more? And when we look at that child, let's look at that child as not somebody who's standing here today, but there could be repercussions for generations and generations, as our story just showed us. And if we're in control in this positive way, we're not only going to bring out so much more positivity, we're going to prevent so much negativeness. Let's just stop and think 1 second, and in that 1 second take control in ourselves. And yes, we can ask our children to be more responsible, and yes, we can ask our children that they should listen to instructions carefully, but it's how we say it and what message we're giving over with it. Good luck.